Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen. The last time you saw me, I was the VP of Community at OfferZen. I'm now the VP of Product at OfferZen. So if you have any complaints about the product, you know where to find me. You can send them to me, or any compliments, also take those. But in all seriousness, would love to speak to you if you're part of the community. And another thing that I dropped in the chat here is that what would be cool is to find out a little bit about who's here. And if you could maybe just write like hiring, like Craig just did, or as an individual, if you're an individual saying like, I'm interested in figuring out like what I'm worth, and that's why I'm interested in benchmarking versus potentially what the members of my team are worth. And also if you want to like say hi from wherever you're coming in from, that's all pretty sweet as well. Cool. So jumping in, you'll see there's Reece and Josh are with us. Reece is from our marketplace team, and Josh is from our content team. Josh is the brains and the brawn behind the salary reports and all of the data that you see. That's from the community side of things. They'll talk a little bit later, and then Reece is more on the platform side of things, but they'll talk about that in a sec. So we do a bunch of different events. We also do a 2 weekly meetup style, just like kind of a Zoom call where a whole bunch of people can get involved. I see Ferret and a couple of people from there are here. And if you want to join that, you can also find that online. And we also do some webinars with partners and external speakers. So just want to say thank you for you taking your time to join us. We hope that we are adding value to you. If you feel like we're not and you have specific questions, please drop them in the chat or the question section. Either of those, whichever suits you, is the best. If it's a specific question which you'd like me to answer or get Reece or Josh to answer, please drop that in the question section and we can offer it live, answer it live, maybe even go fetch the data or get the opinions from the rest of the crew. So I think that's the most of it. Remember that we can't see you, but you can see us. And there will also be some polls every now and then, so please participate in those. And yeah, keep the chat going. Any questions, drop in the question section. We'll make sure we get to them. I think that's about it. Reece and Josh, are you guys ready? Cool.
Let's go. Cool. Thanks so much for the intro, Stephen. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, I'm Reece. I'm part of the Marketplace Insights team, and I want to share some cool insights with you today. So first thing we're going to kick off with is just the agenda. So I thought it would be nice to just start off with a bit of a contextual look at the macro environment. Like, it's super important in understanding developer salaries and where we are at the moment. And then we're going to dig a bit deeper into things like seniority, languages and specializations, and then finally like a bit of a deeper dive on PHP. Because as Josh and I were going through a lot of this data, we identified PHP as a bit of an outlier. And we love PHP here at OfferZen. We did a whole documentary about it, or sponsored a whole documentary about it. So we thought, let's put it in the limelight and figure out what's going on there. So yeah, that's the gist of it. And before we dive into the first topic, I just want to preface what all of this data is based off of. So firstly, the developer survey, our regular annual State of the Developer Nation survey, which is obviously answers and information from our developer community. And then secondly, just our platform data and what developers who are looking for jobs with us telling us and saying. Yeah, let's dig right into the macro and what it means. So first visual we're going to look at is this graph here. So what you're looking at is basically VC funding from 2019 to 2023 per quarter. As you can see, 2021 was pretty much a peak, some would say a bubble. And since then, there's been a sharp decline in VC funding, and we're currently finding ourselves at a low point. What that's meant is a lot of companies are looking to extend their runway and save costs, and unfortunately, that's resulted in a lot of layoffs. I'm sure all of us know that in the past couple of months. And as a result, we have so many more devs in the marketplace. So that's the next visual I want to show you guys. Is just this is basically the number of applications per tech role in the marketplace. So it's tripled since 2021. And I can definitely attest to that. I mean, our team kind of goes through each applications as it comes to an OfferZen, and Q1 was a very, very busy quarter for us. It's the highest number of applications we ever had on OfferZen. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to share this with you guys because I think it's a good time to be looking, or if you're a company, re-looking at the way that you benchmark your salaries. There are a ton of developers in the marketplace. And firstly, you need to be able to kind of isolate what's the highest quality talent and also how should they be compensated. So yeah, that's kind of the groundwork. I think I'm just going to hand over to Josh to kind of get into the specifics of developer seniority and all that comes with that.
Cool. Hey everyone. So as VDH said, I'm Josh. I work a lot on our Dev Nation reports. And I think just building on what Reece said, we're going to talk a bit now about like seniority and how that impacts developer salaries. When it comes to things like benchmarking and understand what someone's worth and what you should be paying, this is a good starting place. So I think some good news, I think to kick us off is, despite the tougher macroeconomic context, slowdown in VC funding, seeing more retrenchments, and a tougher job market in general, we're still seeing year-on-year salary increases for most devs. So especially here at like your 4 years up, we are seeing some growth. Unfortunately, things have slowed down for your juniors. Now, this becomes a little bit clearer if we start diving into actual like salary growth. So in this graph here, I've plotted the average change in developer salary growth over the past 3 years. So what you'll immediately see is there's this big spike in juniors over here in 2023, and then obviously it's dropped off now. So one way of understanding this is that juniors are a lot more susceptible to like shocks in the market. So when things are good, companies are really trying to hire developers, juniors become more in demand, and they see like pretty big increases as teams try to fill open roles. When things are tough and demand for juniors tanks, as Reece I think can attest to, it's really hard for them to keep up that salary momentum. And that's why we are going to see these decreases here. But when we start looking at intermediates and seniors, one thing that's worth noting is they are still seeing salary growth, but it's nowhere near the level that they became accustomed to during the height of the hiring boom. So you'll see here for seniors with more than 10 years of experience, one of the most in-demand groups, they're hovering at around 6-point-something% over the past 2 years. Now, this is still good salary growth, but the picture changes a little bit when we throw inflation into this and we start to see what that's going to do to salaries. So when we're looking at inflation, we're going to start seeing that it's eating away at any real like salary growth that a lot of developers are seeing. So in this graph here, we've got the 2024 average, the 2023 average, and then we've plotted the 2023 average adjusted for inflation. So this gives you a good idea of what developer salaries look like when you start throwing inflation into the mix. And the started line will show you that it's pretty much on track with or exceeding the 2024 average. So for a lot of developers, this means a real decrease in what they're bringing home each month. But for other developers, it means that they're not really seeing the increases that they became accustomed to. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're approaching salary conversations, is bringing this into the macro and being as transparent about that as you can.
Josh, can I just clarify quickly the visualization? The green dotted line is 2023 plus inflation. So if you got an inflation based increase, that's what you would get in the green line. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Cool. Right. Over to you, VDH. Oh, sorry, one last thing. Also, just worth mentioning here that not everyone is going to be equally impacted by slowing salary growth. So in this table, just to give you an idea of what that means, we've looked at year-on-year salary changes for the most popular languages in the community from last year to this year. And what you'll see is you've got some developers who are still seeing healthy growth, whereas other groups are being impacted by this growth and sometimes even decreases. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but I think it's just a good example of why context is so important when you're trying to do your benchmarking. Cool. Now over to you, VDH.
Cool, thanks, Josh. I just saw some people that were adding, so Gerard said there's hiring for JobJack and benchmarking existing employees as well. So I think the first thing that is worth mentioning is that benchmarking as an exercise and looking at this stuff is a critical thing to do, not only when hiring new people, but also to make sure that the people that are within your company are market related. So that's an exercise that we do at OfferZen, make sure that we each year get external data from other sources across all of our roles and make sure that the people that we have are getting paid at market related. Otherwise, you can end up with a pretty big attrition problem. And then the other one is making sure that you are looking at the right kind of benchmarks when going out to the market. We'll talk a little bit later about, you can't always beat the benchmarks, but it's worth knowing what they are. And the other thing that is really important, which should be the next section, is looking at things like language, industry, company size. All of these things have an effect on what that number actually looks like. So we're working internally on tools to enable you as a company to be able to do that. So let's say you're hiring and you want to see a specific role, but then you want to look what it's like for fintech, or you're a bank and you want to look what it looks like outside of the banks. That's kind of the features that we're working on internally to enable you to do that. So maybe if we move on to the next section, we can start to see what some of these factors look like. And then I think we've got a little spotlight later on PHP. It's a specific use case, but it does give you an illustrative example of the impact of some of these factors. So let's continue.
Cool. Thanks, VDH. So yeah, now we're going to dive into a deeper look at like languages and role specialization and how that impacts developer salaries. So we're going to kick off by looking at roles. So just for the purposes of this, we've called things like your back-end and front-end devs specialist roles, because they're specializing on one aspect of the stack. And then full stack more, we've called generalist. Now, what we've seen in the data is specialists are seeing much higher increases than the generalist ones. So over here, the solid line is the 2024 data, and the dotted line is its average from last year. So you'll see back-end developers are still the best paid, and they have seen the biggest increases, especially at the higher levels of seniority, although a slight drop here at the 6 to 10 year mark. What's really interesting is that the gap between front-end and full-stack devs is pretty much closed from 2 years all the way up to 10 years. So previously, you had a very clear hierarchy with back-end at the top, full-stack in the middle, and front-end at the bottom. That's starting to change. One reason might be that companies are starting to, if you're hiring for a specialist, you might need to pay more, whereas if you're with generalists, a lot of developers like the generalist roles because it gives them a chance to work to drive product impact across the entire stack, so back end and front end. And over to Reece, who's going to talk through a similar trend that we're seeing on the platform data.
Sweet, thanks, Josh. Yeah, my visualization is a little bit different. I've not brought in seniority here, so apologies for that. But basically, I wanted to show, I also added an embedded engineer. I think it's a good illustration of another specialist role. It seems like based on this data that since 2022, a lot of the average salaries of these roles have actually started converging. So I guess there's a slight difference there. It's like, although there are still disparities, they're kind of getting closer towards one another, except for, I guess, the case of front-end engineer here, which is a little bit below all the other roles. Although I will say on OfferZen, we do tend to get kind of a higher concentration of junior to intermediate front-end engineers who obviously on average will have a lower salary, so that might be bringing the average down. But yeah, that's kind of what I saw here, is like the gap has been there, but it's kind of narrowing. So yeah.
Reece, we got a question from Craig asking, what do you mean by embedded engineer?
Embedded engineers, I guess that would encapsulate like a whole host of engineers who are working with things like C, C++, that kind of embedded engineer. So someone who, is working on lower level code, I guess.
Then, sorry, I see there's also a question here from Meg. So definitely, I think when you're looking at like benchmarking yourself, I think something we all do is we look at the market either when we last changed roles or when we last got an increase. So there's a bit of like an anchoring there. So this is also why it's so important to have public data like this. So when you're going into that conversation, whether for yourself or your team, you can benchmark based on what's going on in the market right now and not what was going on in the market 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Meg. It's a very serious macroeconomic question, really. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you can also see it as like consumer consumption, to some shape and form. It's a standoff between the system and the people, essentially. And if you're looking at the kind of how these macroeconomic recoveries work, this is one of the core dynamics of it. Is like, how does unemployment drive down inflation? Like, you actually don't want jobs to be being filled if you're trying to correct the market. And the cost of living part of it is exactly that. So where is the pain being felt in the macroeconomic kind of situation or ecosystem, and where is it rectify? There's some really interesting episodes in this of the All In podcast. I think probably about 8 to 10 weeks ago, they covered quite a lot of this macroeconomic stuff. It's really interesting. Have a look.
Then let's move. So moving on to languages now. So I think the takeaway here we're seeing is niche languages are still earning significantly more in 2024, and this is simply just due to supply and demand. So in this graph, we've mapped out the average for each of the main languages in our community and how they compare to each other. So you'll see that the niche languages, especially for seniors, grouped together here at the top. So that's Go, Kotlin, and Ruby. Then you have Python, Java, JavaScript, and C# grouping here, and then PHP at the bottom. So a big reason for that is just supply and demand, which Reece will talk to soon. There's just not a lot of developers, especially senior developers, with these skill sets. So if you are a developer with 10 plus years of experience in Kotlin, you are quite hard to find. If you're hiring that developer, you are going to pay a little bit of a premium because there is more competition for them. So that's something that we're seeing here. Just also to note, PHP down here at the bottom, we will deep dive a little bit into it, but it is interesting that over the past, I think, Stephen, we've done the report now 5 years. Across all of those years, PHP has always been at the bottom of the pile or very near the bottom of the pile. So it's something we'll look into later on. But over to you, Reece.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, this looks like a very similar picture, just using the platform data. I definitely agree. I think the disparity in average salary there is based on scarcity and just fewer and fewer devs having used these niche languages or actually having experience in them. I mean, you do get juniors who will say, I want to use Ruby, or I want to use Kotlin or Go. But I think the disparity in salary really makes itself apparent when you get past like 4 years of experience and you've actually got the tenure in that language. Or some languages, perhaps haven't even been around for long enough that people are looking for the experience with the language. So yeah, I think it's kind of nothing new to see here. Just it's pretty robust trend across both data sources that I wanted to highlight there.
And so just coming back to, just again, niche being in demand or niche being harder to find. If we look at the year-on-year salary change for the languages, you'll see it's your Go's, your Ruby's, your Kotlins who tend to see the biggest increases throughout their careers. One thing I just want to highlight, you'll see Ruby had a pretty big dip here. And this is just one of those quirks of like the niche language data that we've seen going back 3 years, where they'll either start out really strong, like Go here had a 32% increase, and then you'll see a drop off from 2 to 4, and then how they start impacts how they pick up. So Ruby, pretty average for them, big drop, and then they recover. But last year we saw the reverse. So Ruby was following Go's pattern, and Go started out with a decrease, minor increase, and then a similar trend. So that's just, I think, something we're seeing with the niche languages and a slight fluctuation in demand. But again, once they get to those higher levels, things do tend to pick up and stay pretty consistent. And because we're going to go into what's going on with PHP next, I also want to highlight that it's the only language where super seniors saw a year-on-year decrease in their average salaries. So there's definitely something going on there that's worth exploring. And now over to you, Reece. Oh, sorry,
I think it's me. No stress. Craig, you asked a question, how does an engineer with multiple languages affect the salary? I'm going to quickly have a go, and then Reece, Josh, just chime in. Just to note that I think, and Reece and Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this data is not these people, or this is their exclusive language. These are folks with that language. Is that right on both of your data sets? Reece, how does it represent when you're talking about Go salaries? Is it they have Go as a skill, or is it their Go engineer classification?
It would be they have Go as a top skill, so it would be one of the things they're most proficient in.
Okay, so I think one of the things, and it's actually a great segue, thanks Craig, couldn't have done it a lot better, is that languages are just one of the tools that devs use to create value. So I think one of the things that is really interesting about this whole story, and we've been speaking to a bunch of customers about benchmarking in the last weeks, is that they're like, look, okay, what are the filters that I need to put into your benchmarking tool that are hard locks, right? Now, if you put Ruby in, I showed you, or Josh has just showed you what the data does, it goes a bit wild. Now, Ruby isn't extremely kind of, what is the word? It's not easy to switch for other languages, and there are a big kind of differences. But for the most part, one of the things that is very useful to think through is what are translatable languages? And how do I find people that can learn languages? I know from the get-go, it's not an obvious thing, but when you're just starting out in tech recruitment, I think you see a job spec and you look for people that tick all of those boxes. If you're the CTO, you're hiring a bit differently generally. You're looking for people, especially on the smaller type companies, with great skill and indicators in their CV that show you that they learn fast, that they are good to work with, that they are smart, that they understand logic, and all of those kinds of things. So it is quite interesting what we're saying about languages. But what I think is also really interesting, and we'll illustrate it now with the PHP stuff, is what languages actually say about the context of the developer that you're looking at. So because this person's a PHP dev, it may not mean that they're getting paid a certain amount just because PHP is an inferior language. It's not. Half the world is built on PHP. But the dynamics and the context that comes with influence it. And that's what we're going to explore next. So consider, like, when benchmarking, which of your filters you open wider, so like location, that kind of stuff, and consider what it means for language, and what you need that person to do. The argument for locking very tightly to languages in the past was a pretty strong one, but these days with copilots, our meetup this week was about how useful copilots have become to translate. And AI is not really good at like kind of getting context and solving problems just yet. But one thing it's extremely good at is translating. And that's, I don't know if you've seen the new Omni demos, but that works for both human spoken languages and machine languages. So if you are a good JavaScript developer and you need to write PHP, you can write good JavaScript code and translate it to PHP in an instant. Or if you're working and you understand logic, these days with copilots and completes, like module completes inside the IDEs, the stuff becomes a lot more accessible. So the days of being constrained very tightly to a language are maybe somewhat numbered. And that's exciting if you're going to be benchmarking and thinking about who you're going to be able to hire. So that's just something I kind of wanted to add, is that it's important to kind of look beyond language, because as you see, the demand supply dynamics are very constrained and they cause quite a lot of movement in the salaries. And if you're looking for a Ruby dev, sometimes you might just be looking for somebody else that can come on board and onboard quickly and, empowered by AI, move really fast into becoming a Ruby dev in your team. Cool. All right, let's jump into the PHP thing. I think it illustrates quite nicely what I was. Oh, actually, before we do that, we have some tooling like that we're busy with. I did ask this in the last one. I'll ask it again. We are doing this. This is what it looks like on the candidate side. So basically says this is your expectation. So to answer your question, Meg, this is your expectation. This is what's actually happening in the market, and that kind of those blue graphs are how many actual interview requests. So the reality of the market versus what you expect. Obviously, someone sees a distribution. They think they're in the top 95% all of the time. Everybody's in the top 95%. And we have expectation management to do. But we have a tool on the inside as well, where companies can do a similar thing. And if you are wanting access to that or to play around with it, we're still in like very early beta phase, then please just give me a shout. You can just drop it in the chat. I'll also pick it up. So that's what we're trying to do. Remember that as OfferZen, it's really tough for us because companies always think, oh, you're driving candidates' salaries up, and candidates always say, so you're always driving our salaries down. Yes, that is our job. Our job is to create fit. We want people to meet each other in a place which doesn't hurt either of the parties and gives both parties satisfaction, so they can focus on building things and useful things for the market. So yeah, Meg, I got you there. I'll contact you. Cool.
Cool. Next thing we're going to dive into is what's going on in PHP. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, it's a language we love, and we want to kind of deep dive into why it's kind of an outlier in our data sets. So Josh has put together some pretty interesting information.
Cool. Yeah, so I think just to start off, I think by recapping just how much of an outlier it is right now, and it has been over the past 5 years. So this got us thinking, like, it can't just be because people think PHP is a bad language or it's not a useful language or that PHP devs aren't doing great things. As VDH said earlier, half the world is built on PHP. So we started looking at what might be going on, and there are two possible explanations for this. The one is industry, where PHP devs are working, and company size. How big are the companies they're working for? So let's start. We're going to start by looking at industry. So here you have a breakdown of PHP developers by industry, and then that comparison to all the other developers in our data set. So what you'll see is PHP devs are overrepresented in web dev and digital agencies and underrepresented in fintech. So why this matters is later on I'll show you a graph of salary by industry. Fintech tends to be on the higher end when it comes to salary, web development on the lower end. But it's not just industry that's going to impact it, it's also company size. So we're also seeing PHP developers being overrepresented at smaller companies. So especially amongst like your 2 to 10 employees and your 11 to 50. And then they're underrepresented at your enterprise companies. So again, why this matters is smaller companies don't offer the same salaries as your enterprise companies. That's not to say that there aren't great reasons for working at smaller companies, but if salary is the most important thing to you, you're probably going to look elsewhere. And we can actually see this playing out in the salary data. So when it comes to your salary by industry, you'll see web development way down at the bottom over here. And when we looked at the data, our web development companies in this DevNation survey were smaller companies. So we're seeing that overlap there. And again, smaller companies are paying lower average salaries than larger ones. And just highlight that here. So we're comparing enterprise versus your small companies, and you'll see your smaller companies paying less. So taken together, it's not that PHP is a bad language. PHP developers just tend to work at smaller companies in industries that might not pay as much as like fintech, banking, or cloud computing. Cool. So I'm going to hand over to VDH just to kind of like talk through why this is such a useful case study of what to consider when you're doing benchmarking, so that you are paying people fairly and don't get caught up in the tools that they're using and rather the value that they bring to your company.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Josh. So as I mentioned before, I like the PHP example because it gives you like whether we can convincingly say that those conclusions that like PHP devs are paid less because they're in smaller companies, generally because it's web dev, because it's the origin of the internet and WordPress, and there's a lot of correlation, causation conversations we can have. I think that's not necessarily the discussion. That's the most useful. What I think is the most useful is to say there is context, and that context has influenced someone's salary. And that can be from language all the way through to discrimination. And that's why I want to start with the third bullet, is that we don't believe in asking people what they currently earn. We don't believe in you asking someone to give you their payslip and paying them a little bit more than what they were in order to get them to move. We believe in you paying someone what they're worth. And to do that, you need to do the homework. So that's kind of why we're trying to really help companies get an idea of what they should be paying folks, rather than paying them just enough to get them to do the job. While that seems like a good practice at the beginning, it's number one, not fair, but number two, not sustainable, because the market will correct eventually, right? You'll train that person, they'll grow up, they'll maybe move from PHP to some TypeScript or something super popular, and then they'll get poached because you're not doing that adjustment. So I think that's important to add on that side. So when you're looking at someone, look through those types of things and play around with the different industries. So when you've got these benchmarking toolings, whatever everyone's using, ask yourself, what are people in banking earning? And if you're in a bank, what are people in web dev earning? And understand that context. And try and make sure that you're optimizing for a fit between those things. Cool. Yeah, I think I can change the slide. Yeah, okay. Also, just want to kind of reiterate from Josh's side, we're not trying to bash PHP here. We love PHP. We made a documentary about Laravel with the founder, Taylor Otwell, who's actually, his title is the BDFL, which stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. And you can check that out if you're interested. But what we're trying to illustrate is that there are some nuances in this stuff. And if you're going to take hiring on face value and try and tick boxes, you're not going to do it extremely well. It's important that you understand the deeper context of all of these things. So before we get there, the one other thing that I just want to mention is that if we're looking at, let's say, company size, for instance, I'm just going to grab what's this one, company size, and highlight something that Josh mentioned, is we as OfferZen can't compete against some of the big fintechs and all that kind of thing. So it's critically important that once you've done the benchmark, you really understand what is valuable to the people that are on your team. So one of the most useful discussions you can have is when you're having that internal benchmarking discussion with the current folks, ask them why they're there still. If you're doing an adjustment and the person's been kind of underpaid or under market related, try and get a real essence for why the people in your company love your company, because that's going to be the trick to get new people in, regardless of how much you can pay them, because you're never going to be able to pay more than AWS. So it's important that this whole benchmarking thing is seen as an exercise across all things, not just salary, because you're benchmarking against things like benefit, culture, and those kinds of things. So you want to get a feel for where you stand in your remote readiness or policy, your inclusivity, and those other things that are important to people out there that could be looking at your company. Cool. So we'd love to hear and learn from you. Alex is going to put a poll up on the screen. So the one thing that I mentioned is that I'm now the VP of product, and I'm really new. I'm 2 weeks in, and I would love to talk to you if you use OfferZen, because I just have been running around doing community things. One of the major things that I need to do is talk to customers, because I can't help the team build things that are valuable for you unless I know what it is that you want. So if you're willing to talk to me and spend some time with me, please can you opt in, and I'd love to chat. So that's what the poll is for. Cool. I just want to check any of the things on the chat. Cool. So Anna, you mentioned that you're looking at the salaries of candidates coming through and general searches. I'd be really interested to find out. Then it doesn't need to be synchronous in this conversation. Kind of where folks get the salary data. I understand you can look through on LinkedIn, but it's really hard to find what salary those people are actually asking for. Cool. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to drop them into the questions. I see there's a poll that's from us. Anything else? Anything else, Reece or Josh, that you wanted to add that you maybe forgot to add or just popped it in your mind now?
No, nothing. But I mean, I'm always interested to deep dive into data. So any interesting questions, send them our way.
Yeah, I think that's another thing is Josh has access to the full data set. That data set is like 3,500 valid responses. I think how many questions are there? Like 70 questions, something we ask. So that survey cost the economy quite a lot because we take a lot of developers' time. So we have the data, and if you're ever interested, please ping me or Josh, or just hello@OfferZen.com, and just say, look, I'm really interested in what's happening with kind of whether people are interested in pensions across the industries. We can pull that super quickly and send it out. So to exclude outliers, we use the data inputs, at least on the survey side. Maybe Josh, you can answer. Let me not answer for you.
Cool. Yeah. So one of the things we do to actually collect the data is we give people a series of like options, and we take the midpoint of that option. So we don't ask people to input like a raw salary. One of the reasons we do that is we feel people will be more comfortable giving us the data that way. But it also allows us to then exclude outliers because people can't actually accidentally put in another zero or fudge the data that way. And then we do use automated filtering when we bring the data into Looker. So we order the data, we do an outlier analysis, and then we investigate if that's an outlier that's skewing the data, or is it just like maybe someone who's really well paid who took the survey this year. So that's the approach we take.
Reece, do you have a response on our platform data side?
On the platform data side, yeah, I mean, often it's kind of just very manual. So we'll just do some basic on Excel, that kind of thing, removing outliers and kind of a very similar process. Well, obviously not.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we'll do with kind of freeform data sets is we'll use medians because that will give us kind of a more representative answer, and we'll use averages on one with the enums. Cool.
To add on to that, where we'll also look at medians and stuff, is we remove outliers, especially almost as a rule if we're using external data sets. One of the reasons being is we know people look at an average and decide, okay, this is what I think I should be paid or what I should be getting. So we're very careful to make sure that we're not skewing the data in that way. So if you see an average from us and we're using an external data set, we've tried really hard to control for that reason.
Can you also answer Anna's question? She's asking about whether it's cost to company, basic bonuses. Can you give us the wording exactly in the survey?
Yeah, sure.
Not quite exactly, but maybe just the answer to Anna's question. Sorry.
Yeah, so we do ask people for their average or their salary as a part of their total cost to company. We don't explicitly ask like around bonus or like other benefits. That is something we're looking into for the next survey. And we've got some feedback that it would be helpful if we could just break that down a little bit more.
Cool. Yeah, and I think as we've moving more towards the space, like we're kind of learning with you and with your questions and feedback, I'm starting to learn and understand the value and the details there. So we're gonna kind of up that a little. Cool. And then there's one more question around outliers. Is there a statistical methodology that we're using for the outliers? Who's Reece or Josh? Do you have any specific answers to that?
So for me, one of the ways I determine what an outlier is I look at 75th and 25th percentiles, and then compare someone based on how they fall outside of that. So I'll plot them against their distribution and then see how those things move and affect the distribution. It's not always perfect. So this is something specifically for third-party data. It's not always perfect, but what we're trying to do is follow that shape of the distribution to make sure we're not skewing anything.
And the idea also, again, is using those input enums is that we just put outliers into a bracket, which will give us a median. So I think that's kind of fairer on the market. But yeah, Craig, if you have any other questions on the methodology stuff, please send through them. You can just send it again, hello@OfferZen, and we'll route it to Josh or Reece, depending on which one you're after. Cool, folks. I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. Oh, I know it's typing. Should we always find this question? No, she's not typing. All right. If there are any other questions, the recording will be sent to you. Alex, is that right? Maybe you can just drop the answer in the thing. Yes, it will be sent to you, and it will be available at offerzen.com/events. You can see all the recordings from all of our events that are publicly recorded. Our meetups are not recorded. That's because we say dumb things there, and we don't want that on the internet. So if you want to come and say dumb things with us, please join us every 2 weeks. Engineering leaders, pretty much exclusively. And the idea there is that we're not the content, the audience is the content. So we try and curate it a little bit. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you at an OfferZen event soon. And I look forward to chatting to those people who have opted in. And see you soon. Enjoy the rest of your week. Ciao.